Well, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar focused on some of the proven tricks of the trade when it comes to the planning and execution of patient recruitment and retention programs. Specifically, how the approach will change for different study types. The focus of the webinar today will be on 4 different study types in particular: chronic conditions, acute conditions, rare and orphan disorders, and last but not least, geriatric programs. I'm Dan McDonald. I'm the Director of Business Development for DAC Patient Recruitment Services, and I will be your host and moderator for this event. Today's webinar platform features an interactive chat box typically positioned on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use this feature to pose questions to the presenter, and we will note all of your questions and save them for the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. With that, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Melinda Gertz. Melinda is the VP of Operations for DAC Patient Recruitment Services, a more than 20-year-old provider of global patient recruitment and retention services for the biopharmaceutical industry. Melinda has worked in the healthcare field for the past 23 years, about 17 of which she has spent focused on working closely with biopharmaceutical executives to architect and execute patient recruitment and retention strategies for their global clinical trials. She's also worked tirelessly to educate the public at large about the importance of participating in clinical research. Melinda is a regular and well-known speaker at industry conferences, and she has authored numerous articles and chapters in industry trade journals. She's a longtime industry colleague of mine and what I would consider to be one of the true gurus on this subject. So with that, I am pleased to turn it over to you, Melinda.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to everyone for attending this afternoon. It's really great to see all of you with us today for this webinar, and hope that as we go through the discussion and talking about the importance of planning for your recruitment and retention needs, that you're able to walk away with some pearls of wisdom that you may consider as you're going through and planning for your programs and to support your enrollment efforts. You know, when we get started here talking about setting the stage related to just the increasing complexities of clinical trials, it's both exciting and frustrating at the same time when we look at the challenges that we're up against. And before we even look specifically at a particular protocol and the patient population that we're trying to target, I mean, when you just look at what we have to go through for the actual conduct of a clinical trial, that just further increases the complexity. So wanted to share a couple of these 5 different viewpoints with you related to some of the challenges that the individuals we work with that are actually conducting the clinical trials are reporting as some of the obstacles that they're having to go through. You'll see here that 69% of patients say they have not participated in a clinical trial because they just weren't aware that clinical trials were out there. This continues to speak to the ongoing need that we as an industry have to do a much better job at educating the public at large about clinical trials and that it might be an option for them. So that continues to be a challenge, and also is probably the reason why recruitment tends to be the #1 reason why studies do not complete on time. Then when we look at the study coordinators, well, 28% of them say that the inclusion and exclusion criteria have the single biggest impact on patient recruitment success. So obviously this does speak to when we look at a particular patient population we're trying to target, and then you overlay that with the inclusion and exclusion criteria, you may take a wider circle that very quickly becomes very finite based on that inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then we have to look at the support that those study coordinators may need to help them identify patients if when their practice, when their database becomes more limited, how can we put into place a program that can help expand their database and expand their reach. The investigators, 76% of them, say that they are involved either in the right amount or maybe too many clinical trials. So there again, we have to keep in mind that when we are conducting trials, that we are not only trying to vie for the same patient population with all the competing trials out there, but when you have a research site that is doing multiple clinical trials, not necessarily with the same patient population, but their resources you're vying for the resources there at the site. So that's something to always consider with your recruitment or retention planning. 70% of the sponsors said the hardest part of the patient recruitment is finding the right investigators. And that's absolutely true. There's a lot of things, a lot of talk about big data, electronic health records, all of that's coming into play that's really helping us get more savvy into identifying the right investigators. But we still have over 60% of investigators only do 1 or 2 clinical trials, and then they get out of doing clinical trials. And so there's that constant churn of new investigators that are coming on board. So then you are having to look at additional training that may be needed, and that can add to your timeline. And then last but not least, when we look at the regulation, when we look at FDA, they tell us that there's a 233% increase in patients required per NDA from 1,500 in the 1970s to more than 5,000 today. So that just, I think, speaks volumes related to the competitive landscape that we find ourselves working within. This next slide talks about what typically drives enrollment success. And so, you hear the common phraseology of a third of your sites are going to meet and exceed their enrollment goals. A third of the sites are probably going to just meet their enrollment goals. And then you can have a third of the sites that just aren't going to be able to contribute to the overall enrollment goal. And this really has us think about, when we are planning for supporting the sites, you go at it wanting to know that you can support all of the sites that are participating in the program, but at some point in time, what are the different milestones or key performance indicators that you may want to put in place during your planning phase of maybe you have a tiered plan that supports the sites that fall into the different rungs. And there definitely is a direct correlation to being able, there's a direct correlation of how soon a site enrolls a patient into a trial to what their ultimate success is going to be and being able to meet their enrollment goals. So here we can see that if a site all this data is actually from site initiation. So if a site can enroll a patient within 30 days from when they're initiated, they have a 90% plus chance of success. If it gets pushed to 60 days, they still have a fairly good chance. They're at 50% chance of success. But if it gets pushed to 90 days or later, they have less than 10% chance of success. So here it is absolutely key to try to minimize as many delays as possible from study initiation to when the sites are actually able to enroll. There oftentimes there were things that come up with the manufacturing of the compounds or the use with getting the devices delivered, those things that can cause delays at the very beginning. You may just want to think for your planning, if those indeed do happen, what are some of the communication efforts you can make with the sites to make sure that they're on board and they're ready to start when everything is in place. So next we want to talk about planning considerations. And there are, in terms of when you're looking to plan for a recruitment or retention program, there are probably a multitude of planning considerations to consider. This list isn't meant to be a full comprehensive list. It's just I came up with 8 planning consideration points for us to discuss today and to set the stage as we take you through the various case studies. So here the different considerations we have are looking at the patient population, the disease prevalence. So when we know we're looking for a particular patient population, what does that disease prevalence look like in the regions in which you're conducting your trial? How many patients are actually required for the study? The length of enrollment, where the sites are located, and how well does that match up to the prevalence in the geographic locations of where our target population is. Regulatory agencies, whether it's a central IRB, local IRB, or even the use of ethics committee. This becomes extremely important when you are planning for different strategies because the regulatory agency is going to be an additional timing that you're going to have to add into your plan. Communication with sites. Do you have an open communication with your sites? And is it a two-way communication? Is it not just you always funneling information to them, but when you need to get that information back from the site, are they able to get you the information that you need? And last but not least, the importance of metric tracking. Anytime you put a plan together and you roll out initiatives to support the site, you want to make sure that part of your plan includes a way for you to be able to track metrics so that you can evaluate your ROI and also help you decide, are the initiatives you put in place, are they successful? Are they not as successful as you planned? And if so, what changes do you need to make? So metric tracking really helps you fulfill that proactive contingency planning that's required throughout the program. So we're going to move into the rest of the presentation where I want to share with you 4 case examples where planning took on a different look and feel based on the therapeutic indication. The 4 case examples are going to be in a highly prevalent chronic condition. There will be a case example for an acute condition. We'll look at a rare disease and orphan indication. And then finally, we'll look at a study by where predominantly the target population was an older population. So as we go through each of these case studies, you'll see that the first 3 are really focused on recruitment strategies, and the last one is focused on retention strategies. So for our first case example, this is the highly prevalent chronic condition, and the condition we selected, a case example we're sharing with you today, is in COPD. This program was a phase 3 study. It was a phase 3 52-week study investigating the effectiveness, safety, and tolerability of medication on the exacerbation rate and pulmonary function in COPD patients. The details of the study, they needed 1,500 patients, and they were looking to enroll all of these patients within a 12-month period. From discussions with the sponsor as well as reviewing the protocol, there were several challenges that were identified that really spoke immediately to how this could potentially impact the rate of enrollment. There was the requirement that the COPD exacerbation within a 12-month period prior to randomization had to be documented and presented. They had to do a pulmonary function test at each visit. The patient traveled to the study site. There were lots of visits within the participation period, and they projected that there was going to be a fairly high screen fail rate of 35% and higher. So if you think back to the H criterion that I shared with you earlier, when you think about recruitment planning for this COPD study, a couple of things come to mind that came into play with developing a plan. You have your patient population and disease prevalence. And if you can see there with the map, and this was a North American program. So as you can see here within North America, this happens to be a prevalence heat map that is supported by ICD-9 claims data associated with COPD. And the red areas are the hot or higher prevalence areas, and the blue areas are the cold, lower prevalence areas. So one of the things to take into consideration for planning is, again, exactly what is the disease prevalence in the regions that you are looking to enroll for the study. So here you could see that the prevalence is really higher, more in some of your Midwest and Eastern states within the United States here. The other thing to take into consideration are the number of patients in the site, right? So they know that they're thinking they're going to have a pretty or fairly significant high screen fail rate for COPD at 35% or higher. So you know that you're going to have to, in your plan, really cast a wide net in trying to keep the funnel full enough in order to process enough individuals so that they can ultimately be screened and then be enrolled into the study. And because back to the setting the stage when we really were looking at the complexities of where we are today within the industry and just within the available patient population that can participate in clinical trials, that group of people, despite the fact that we're still having a challenge with getting individuals properly educated that clinical trials are even a possible option for them, it just that the available patient population, because of all the medical advancement we had, that population pool just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then when you overlay the protocol requirements and the disease prevalence, it even becomes more finite. So we are finding ourselves more now than ever having to support the sites with external enrollment efforts. And it's not that they're not great sites, and it's not that they aren't good at their jobs in enrolling patients. It's just the competition is getting so fierce that we are finding that other support elements are required and needed. A couple of other considerations for this particular program were the regulatory agencies and timelines. So from a positive, the majority of these sites were central IRB, which means we were able to get materials developed and rolled out very quickly. That would be something for you to definitely take into consideration in your planning for programs, is that if you have a study, say one that's late stage oncology, you may be working with a lot of academic centers that are going to require that have local IRBs. Well, those local IRBs may only meet once a month. They may only meet once every other month. Those are all things to not lose sight of and to keep in the back of your mind when you're developing different strategies and whether or not those strategies need regulatory approval or not. And then again, the communication. Do you have strong communication with the study coordinators and with the investigators? Because that's really important for two things. One, it keeps the sites engaged and motivated in wanting to pay attention and focus on your particular trial. But it also is extremely helpful when you're needing to get that information and those metrics back from those sites so you know whether the program you've put in place is successful or not. Being able to have that open line of communication and dialogue with the sites is when that becomes extremely important in obtaining that information. So there were several recruitment initiatives that were executed to support this particular program. You can see them here. They went anywhere from the study branding to creating a sort of a unique look and identity for this particular study amongst the many other COPD studies that were in recruiting at the particular time. There were study awareness materials for the site and educational materials to help the study coordinators as they were doing the just educating individuals about the trial and during the informed consent process. It did include using strategies of reaching out to the communities, both public community as well as the physician community. There was a targeted advertising component and other online and direct mail initiatives. And then last but not least, there was also a retention support element to this program. There was a 12-month enrollment period, but there was a 18-month study participation period. So there was some concern that over time individuals would start to be lost to follow-up or not maintain study compliance by not being able to come to all of their study visits without some additional support. And as you can see, that program, that plan, so produced positive results. It helped the study stay on track with where they needed to be and ensured that they were going to meet their enrollment goals. So the enrollment was definitely met on time. But the considerations in the beginning is what really, all of that happened in advance. So this case study was not a rescue case study. It was proactively planned. So all of those considerations were things that were thought about at the forefront of designing their recruitment program. So we move to the second indication that we wanted to present to you, and that is looking at an acute condition, and we selected gout as our case example to share with you here today. This happened to be a phase 2 study evaluating the safety and efficacy of medication in the treatment of acute flares in gout patients who were refractory or had contraindication to NSAIDs. The study details for this, again, there were 35 U.S. sites, the more U.S.-centric here. There were 50 patients that were needed, and there was a 6-month enrollment period. Again, this was one that was identified really proactively for this program. So there were challenges that were identified that were discussed with the study team in terms of some of the things that we collectively as a team would want to put together to help them in their recruitment planning. The biggest challenge for this program is that these individuals had to be identified within a 5-day window. Because they could not be allowed to be on certain medications prior to being enrolled into the study. And once they were, if they were prescribed that medication, it would exclude them from the study. So we really had a small, finite window of time to be able to identify these patients and present to them this study for consideration. So going back and looking at the consideration criteria, again, with the patient population and disease prevalence, while there is a fairly strong disease prevalence within the United States for gout, because the protocol required that 5-day window, identification window, that took our patient population pool and immediately just truncated it and made it really small. The number of patients in site, we were looking at a minimum site enrollment of 1.5 patients per site. From a regulatory agency and timeline perspective, there was strong proactive planning, and so we could ensure that the initiatives were launched on time. So as I said, this was done proactively. Again, the majority of the sites were central IRB, so it allowed us to really develop a program very quickly and get it rolled out and implemented at the site level. And also, again, to consider the positives of having that direct communication with the study coordinators. So because of the challenge that was identified, this program really took a twofold approach in helping with enrollment and enrollment enhancement activities. One, it was working with the treating physician, focusing on identifying and accessing patients at the point of care. So helping the sites determine how do you identify how do you identify patients, my apologies, for participating in a clinical trial. What does that process look like? Actually walking that through with them and mapping it out and coming up with the identification referral process and making sure there were not any gaps in that process. And if there were gaps in that process, what could we do to help close those gaps? And then secondly, direct to patient outreach. So reaching out directly to gout patients who had regular flare-ups. We did this through reaching out to the community, to support group organizations that were located within the communities of where the research sites were located, as well as a targeted advertising support program. So the outcomes for the gout study, you can see here that the recruitment campaign was adopted by the majority of the sites. A lot of times the sponsor will give the sites the option as to whether they want to participate or receive external support or not. I would say more today than ever, we are seeing even higher adoption rates from sites requesting and accepting external support to help them meet their enrollment goals that they've contracted with you for. And related to the campaign specifically, you can see that having educational materials to help in the process of identifying individuals and getting them enrolled into the study, and then the radio media, so the advertising piece had the highest response rate that drove the majority of the referrals. Or the radio media drove the highest amount of external referrals to the research sites for consideration. Related to a rare disease, we picked Raynaud's phenomenon to present to you. And as I said earlier, when we asked the polling question, by definition, although by the clinical definition this falls into a rare disease, your own personal definition, you may be thinking something on the much more rare side, like I said earlier with Womack's disease. We do have experience in those indications as well, and I think a lot of the planning considerations that we've been discussing all along through the presentation speak to all of your rare orphan indications. The strategies will take on a different look and feel in terms of what your approach may be. You might be a little more limited in terms of when you're reaching out to individuals to self-identify and self-refer, but there's still options out there that you can support your site in helping them identify patients if they get to a point to where their own internal database becomes exhausted. So speaking specifically for this case study, this happened to be a phase 2 study to assess the efficacy of the once daily administration of the medication for the treatment of vasospasm in primary and secondary Raynaud's phenomenon. This happened to be a global program. There were 71 sites that were involved. There were 14 countries. You can see all the countries that are listed there. Their target was to enroll 208 patients within a 10-month enrollment period. There were a number of challenges, again, that were identified. This, too, happened to be a proactive program where there was a lot of consideration and discussion with the clinical team at the sponsor level as to what they foresaw their challenges to be. There was a small patient population. The recruitment of primary Raynaud's, more of a challenge than secondary Raynaud's. And there were 2 arms of this study that were going to be recruiting or enrolling simultaneously. Patients must have had a fairly active disease, which further narrowed the size of the patient population. Potential patient concerns related to concomitant drug restrictions and washout periods, that definitely was going to pose, or they thought would pose as a potential challenge for someone to decide whether they wanted to participate or not. The study design itself, in that it was a placebo-controlled study, that's always a challenge. And then the exclusion of smokers may be an issue internationally. That was an exclusion criteria that they thought might be a challenge as well. So when we talked about the patient population and the disease prevalence, and we looked at the limited patient population due to the limited disease prevalence, and then when you coupled it with the study criteria, that was something we knew that we were going to have to develop strategies and a plan that could offset that particular challenge. When you're also looking, again, your number of sites and patients and the breakdown that was required for this particular program between primary and secondary Raynaud's, and the strong considerations when determining, which strategies to use and going and identifying those patients, and then again tracking the outcomes, what was going to be the best way to track those outcomes, and how were we going to be able to show a direct impact of those outcomes associated with enrollment activity. And oftentimes, too, the strategies that we would consider, for a rare indication, when you think about them, sometimes you think to yourself, well, those really sound more like retention-oriented strategies than they do recruitment strategies. But oftentimes, if a solution on the front end can be offered during the enrollment period, it can help offset the potential of a retention challenge that could come down the pike a little bit later on in the study. So there were several initiatives that were executed, and taking all of the challenges into consideration, there's a couple of here that were able to be executed. The plan involved aggressively engaging the study sites to build a strong relationship with study staff. So really providing some educational materials, some patient identification tools, training that really helped engage and motivate the site and help offset some of the concern that they had with how enrollment might go for this particular program. Through some of the study awareness materials, the program helped raise internal study knowledge to keep the sites focused on identifying patients. There was also an external component to it that helped individuals identify that the study might be a particular opportunity for them, and it encouraged them to self-refer for participation. And then last but not least, there's that physician element piece that became that was very important in helping to establish external referral pathways into the clinical trial and into the participating research sites. So you can see here in the upper left corner the different referral sources that were used, just to give you an idea of what the program consisted of related to educational materials, to targeted advertisement, online initiatives, and what the outcomes of those were. So these were the various referral sources. Also then thought it'd be interesting to share with you the creative design and concept that was used for this particular study. This was a very effective campaign, a very good planning on the sponsor's part and how they wanted to execute the campaign with their site. The study did enroll 3 months early, and they were actually to achieve 213 patients out of the 208 target. So then we'll now move into our...
Step in here
yes.
for a second. I'm going to put up another poll, and you can maybe take just a short break. They've been talking a lot.
Right.
And we'll actually open this up to sponsors and CROs. I know it does say sponsors on the question, but would certainly like to understand whether your company allocates clinical trial budget dollars specifically to patient recruitment. And I think we can just keep this up and let it sort of run in the background as you continue forward with the presentation. I know that we only have about 15 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you, Dan. Just take a quick look here. And then you can just let me know when all the results come in. Just let me know what that looks like. But in the interest of time, I will move to our last and fourth case study. And as I mentioned, this case study really focuses on retention planning as opposed to recruitment planning. And we selected an Alzheimer's disease study, and this is a mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease study, phase 3 study. This happened to be a North American-based study with 176 sites. They were looking for a little over 2,000 patients, and the retention period was 22 months. So as you can see here, there were a number of challenges that the team identified. Now, I will also say that this happened to be a rescue study. So the study enrolled, let me just say that this retention program came in play midway during the entire study, the study timeline. The team did not anticipate that they were going to start experiencing attrition rates at the level that they did. When the attrition rates got to a certain level that it became a concern, that is when they decided to start engaging in retention planning. And maybe we need to think about, okay, what are some of the challenges we're seeing? What are the sites telling us? Let's look at the people that are withdrawing from the study. Are there controllable versus non-controllable reasons as to why somebody is withdrawing from the study. For those that are what we would define as a controllable reason, maybe it's the burden of the individual getting to and from the study visit. You can offer transportation assistance, something of that nature. Are there services that could be implemented that could help mitigate that so that you weren't losing individuals? So as a team, the challenges included the time commitment and logistical challenges to the caregiver. As most all Alzheimer's disease studies require that the caregiver is actively involved in the study and attends all the visits most of the time. The ongoing stress that caregivers of Alzheimer's disease patients deal with on a daily basis and how this compounds over time. Just the nature of the disease and the limits it has with patients' capabilities, and it creates a need for functional study compliance support. Some of the mild adverse events experienced by patients, such as headache, dizziness, fatigue, were the top 3 adverse events that were noted for patients that had discontinued. The length of the study visits, this was an infusion. There were quite a bit of time that had to be spent at each of the study visits, the frequency of the study visits. Again, keeping in mind that not only the study participant is actively involved in the study, but also the caregiver. And so the added burden that this adds to 2 parties versus 1. And the current rate of attrition, there were 2 studies that were running concurrently, was at 8%, and in study B, it was at 9%. However, what they were seeing is they did not, attrition could not, the way they had calculated their p-value is attrition could not exceed 15%. So this is getting really close, or for them, too close to comfort, to that 15% threshold. So they decided, let's put together a retention program that can try to help mitigate, as I said, and or minimize some of these challenges that were just presented. Again, here with the consideration criteria, looking at the patient population, knowing that you're dealing with an older patient population with limited mobility and having to have the dependence on a caregiver, the number of patients and sites that are involved, and again, looking at the number of patients that needed to be retained so that the study could have statistical significance when it was completed. The regulatory agencies and timelines, this again had major impact on the strategies that the plan could utilize in order to get it in place to actually start having an impact on those attrition rates. So there were several initiatives that were executed. Obviously, the objective of this retention program was to reduce the monthly attrition rate and to engage patients and caregivers regularly throughout the study. So I won't read them all to you because they're on the slide in front of you. You can see them there, the different initiatives that were implemented to maintain an ongoing communication with the patients and the caregivers. And while all of these played a significantly important role in reducing the overall attrition rate, I will tell you that being able to offer the transportation assistance and providing transportation to and from study visits, coupled with the electronic patient stipends, had the biggest impact on the reducing the or keeping the retention rate status quo without any increase from where it was when the plan was put into place to help the study sites with that. So it actually, for those particular ones, I think it ultimately was able to reduce, attrition by about 46%. And so here you can see also the results, the results of that retention program and where they were at related to the reduction from when they implemented the plan to where ultimately they were able to fall out at the end of the study. So thankfully they were able to, as I mentioned, keep attrition at bay, and it did not increase to such levels that it became a concern that they would have to then consider maybe redoing the study. And with that, That concludes the presentation. I thank you all very much for your time. I think we have about 10 minutes left. So thank you very much for staying with us, and I will open it up to any questions that any of you may have that we can answer.
Yeah, thank you, Melinda. That was terrific, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope that the presentation was useful and that you were able to hear us and see the presentation clearly. We do have some questions. There were some questions that were coming in as you were speaking, Melinda, and we might have some time for a couple of additional questions. If you'd like to go ahead and post those in the chat feature and send those along to us, we'll do our best to get to them. The first question actually came up when you were presenting the case study about COPD, and the question was related to what specific types of materials were provided to the sites and what materials were given, I guess, to educate patients as part of that COPD program. I know that you might have talked a little bit to this, but if you could elaborate any more on that, Melinda, that'd be great.
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. Related to the site, the materials that were given were what fall into what we call a recruitment kit, which are study-specific flyers, posters, brochures, educational pamphlets that provide some more detail about the study. Those are items that can be provided to the individual when they're considering to participate. It helps further, reiterate the points that the study coordinator is making with them. We also provided for other materials directly to the site, we provided tools to help them identify sites. So the similar tools that you're used to hearing about with pocket protocols, inclusion and exclusion cards, informed consent flip charts, pre-screening worksheets, those tools were other materials that were provided. We also had put together a quick cheat sheet too to help remind individuals when they were being on the phone talking to them about coming in for their screening visits, reminding them of all the things that they needed to bring with them. So, for instance, if you'll remember, I mentioned they had to have documentation that they had an exacerbation 12 months, within the last 12 months. They had to bring that documentation in. That actually was a big challenge, was getting everybody to bring in the proper documentation. So we also helped put together like a one-page cheat sheet for study coordinators to use when they were talking to individuals on the phone, just to remind them of the various things that they needed to bring for their screening visit, so they wouldn't have to be rescheduled. And then for the patient themselves, most of the materials or information that they learned about the study came through the television and radio advertising that was utilized, that was very successful, as well as the study-specific website and direct mail campaign that was used.
Thank you. There's another question that came through, and I know you'll have a lot to say about this because I know that these groups are playing a larger and larger role. But somebody had asked about the role that patient advocacy groups are playing in the recruitment of studies focused on rare diseases.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, huge. A patient advocacy group has a huge role in recruiting patients for rare diseases, and most of the sponsors that I know that focus in the rare disease indication, they actually have usually an individual that is exactly their sole focus on the team. Is there a patient advocacy manager, director, coordinator? That's something also that recruitment providers can do as well, where they're developing relationships with these patient advocacy groups to let them know about the trial opportunities so that they can be referred. Many of your rare disease groups are extremely well affiliated or close-knit, and they are out everywhere looking for information. I will tell you specifically for the Womack's disease, rare disease study that I referenced, I will tell you that that entire program, we did a program, we helped us sponsor with a program, that entire program just had the patient advocacy piece to it, and that was it. There were about 5 or 6 worldwide advocacy groups that supported Womack's disease, and it was our job in supporting the sponsor to go to those advocacy groups and really to educate them about this clinical trial, also about what the sponsor was doing, and get individuals enrolled into the study. So it has just plays a huge role when it comes to rare disease.
Okay, I think we probably have time for another question. I think this is related to probably the Alzheimer's case study that was presented. And the question was, what was presented on the study-specific website to the patients?
Yeah, so for that retention program, we did develop a website that was username, password protected, that was available for the patients and the caregivers. It also had a dual side that was available for and act as a portal for the study site. For the patients, what it included were a number of things. It had the information about the study again, and the purpose of the study and why it was being conducted. It had access to the visit schedule and calendar. It had provided reminders that could be sent to them through either email or through a telephone call that would remind them if there were if they needed to be fasting prior to a particular visit, that it would send a reminder to them. It would provide all the details that they would have to be prepared for each visit. It also provided a list of resources, so different advocacy groups, professional organizations. It provided as a resource for those individuals as well.
Okay, terrific. And since we still have quite a few people online with us here, I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. And this question is focused on how you determine what types of strategies and tactical initiatives will be used to support recruitment on a study. For example, past experience, or sponsor direction, or site feedback. How are strategies developed?
Yeah, so strategies it's a combination of all of that. Strategies definitely come about when you're working with a team. You're going to look at the protocol. You're going to look at what the protocol requirements are. Depending on what phase you're in, if you're looking to develop a plan for a phase 3 study, obviously you're going to go back and look at your historical metrics on a phase 2 study. And what challenges did you encounter there? Did you have to do any planning? What was successful, what wasn't successful? If you're engaging with an external vendor to help you with your recruitment or retention planning, absolutely, those folks, they're going to be looking at their historical metrics. They should be able to have case studies and information that they can share with you in terms of not only the successes, but also the not so successful programs, the lessons learned. Every time we're doing a plan and doing a program, the outcomes of that just then lay the framework for the next time you want to do a program, and each time build upon the success of that and generating the outcomes. So all of that comes into play with the direct feedback from sponsors, their historical experience with their studies. If you're working with the vendor, their historical experience with recruiting or retaining for the particular patient population. And then, of course, last but not least, obviously looking at the target population, the disease prevalence, and really the viability of whether we're able to successfully recruit and retain for a particular program.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, often we'll look at even feedback directly from the sites and surveying the sites to understand what has worked well for them in the past, what things are they expecting to be challenges on the protocol, and what types of support do they think they're going to need in order to be successful with recruitment and retention on a study. So to your point, it's really a 360-degree perspective that is taken into account in order to develop a strategic plan for a program. Okay, well, we thank you all certainly for joining us today, for staying on throughout the presentation. We had a terrific turnout. We are hopeful that you found the time to be useful. I know you took time out of, for many of you, the middle of your day, and so we very much appreciate it. There is going to be a follow-up email sent to you, which will have a link to the slide deck that was shared with you today. We will also ask you to complete a survey regarding the webinar and the content and the quality of the technical aspects of the webinar. So please take some time to fill that out for us. We'd greatly appreciate it so we can improve on these going forward. And I know that we've also recorded the webinar, and we will make that available to you shortly, and we'll send out an email when that is available. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you very much once again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and have a terrific weekend. Thank you so much.